One of the reasons why we're talking about this particular sample of Sapphire HD 6850 is to keep its review video to an appropriate size. Joking aside, the main reason is so that you can avoid the mistakes that I made and maybe make use of what I learned in the process. As for the fact that the 6850 is still alive, well, I think most of the credit goes to Sapphire. So, let's go through the history of mishandling that this card had to go through. Upon arrival, the video card did output an image, albeit at a 1024 by 768 resolution. A look in the device manager showed the display adapter being your generic Microsoft one. Since we're talking about a Terascale 2 card, the drivers available for it are of an older date. Either the VHQL approved Catalyst 15.7.1 or the beta Radeon software Crimson Real Live 16.2.1 will normally do fine. In the case of the 6850, the PC literally froze when attempting to install the driver. I mistook this for a VBIOS issue. Some of you already know where this is going. So, using the AMD VB Flash Win utility from Tech PowerUp, I proceeded to first save the existing VBIOS of the card. In case I'd screw up, the plan was to use the second fully sized PCIe slot on my PC to add another card and flash it back. I then downloaded all the VBIOS files that made sense for my model and started to open them in the same utility. To my surprise, I even found the VBIOS I recently exported, and using the file compare tool from the command line, I found the files to be identical. If that wasn't a red flag that I was going in the wrong direction, then I don't know what is. I tried flashing the card using the downloaded file, not the one I exported, using various options to force the flash. Nothing changed and the driver would still not install. I then flashed a VBIOS that had a version string with only a minor difference. The card just stopped displaying any video after reboot. To make things even worse, my plan for using the second PCIe slot was a no-go. While the slot is functional, the connectors placed close to it make it impossible to slot in another 2-slot card. Luckily, I ended up getting access to an AMD FM2 Plus motherboard and an A6 5400K APU. This allowed me to boot a Windows on the go USB stick with the AMD Flash utility and the original VBIOS. Another reflash later, and the 6850 once again displayed an image. But like before, it would not install the driver. We were back on square one. Having ruled out the VBIOS as the cause for the card's behavior, and since there were no obvious signs of damage on the PCB or the components soldered on it, I suspected that the issue was caused by some bad solder joints on the GPU itself. Now, a few years back I was able to resuscitate a laptop motherboard that stopped working by heating it up in the electric oven. The procedure is to heat up the oven at 200-220°C, place the board on a few tinfoil balls on a pan, then bake it for 5-10 minutes. The balls keep the card from touching the pan. Furthermore, one may consider wrapping more sensitive parts that are not the target of the procedure in tinfoil. When I did the procedure on the video card, however, I unfortunately did two things differently. First, I left the entire board exposed, and second, I had the board in the oven from the very first moment I turned it on, instead of first preheating the oven. The result speaks for itself, and if electrolytic capacitors were to act as a thermometer for a steak, the exploded ones from the board would read very, very well done. To get this card back to run, the option was to replace all electrolytic capacitors. Just because the others didn't blow up does not mean that they were in a top shape. One minor issue that I ran into when ordering the parts was the size of the 470 microfarads at 12 volts capacitors. The only polymer low ESR ones available were a bit larger. Still, I ordered them anyway, hoping that there is still enough room for them on the PCB and under the plastic shroud. A few mornings of desoldering and resoldering, and the capacitors were in. The ones that would prevent the shroud from being screwed on were left with their terminals a bit longer, so that we would get just enough wiggle room. To say that I was anxious to try the graphics card is an understatement. On the test rig, it powered on, and displayed the low resolution image I hoped for. The drivers installed, and GPU-Z recognized it just fine. And after running Unigene's Heaven benchmark, I was confident that the card was working fine. Temperature stayed within normal range, and performance was on par with the expectations. So, here are a few lessons to take from this whole adventure. Have an APU handy when attempting a VBIOS flash. Always save the old BIOS. If what you saved is identical with the one that you downloaded, then the BIOS is probably fine. If the driver installer package recognizes the card as valid for the driver to be installed, it means that it was able to read the VBIOS. The VBIOS might not be the issue, well, except for the fake GTX 1050s that keep popping up. If you suspect a bad solder joint in one of the BGA components, like the GPU or the memory, use a hot air station, or at worst, a hot air gun on the affected components, and watch out for the solder melting. If you decide to bake the card instead, preheat the oven first and protect the large electrolytic capacitors. Also, don't hold it in for too long. As for the HD6850, it did its tour in my PC, where it performed according to expectations. Rather weak, where shaders were used intensively, like in Control, and better in games where mostly the rasterizer output mattered. And to keep with the tradition, the HD6850 was allowed to get some R&R in its cardboard box only after winning its own victory royale.